You're listening to the DolphinsTalk.com podcast network. Welcome to Dolphins Talk Weekly, your one-stop audio breakdown of all of this week's Miami Dolphins news. Now, here is your host, Kevin Durr.
Welcome to another episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly. I am your host, Kevin Dern. You can follow me on Twitter at KevinMD4. You can follow the show on iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker, Podbean, wherever else you listen to your podcasts. I am actually returning to solo flight for this week's episode, as Evan Morris is off doing things in Navy flight school, flying around and taking classes and whatever else that entails, serving our country. So Evan, thank you. We'll have him back on another episode coming out probably next week. But for now, flying solo, wanted to give my thoughts on recapping the Dolphins draft class, undrafted free agents, the Odell Beckham signing, and kind of where things stand with the Miami Dolphins roster right now as we head into OTA season and kind of nearing the last big milestone, which is the schedule release, which is rumored to happen next week. Nothing confirmed yet. But after that, it's really kind of the dead period of the NFL until training camps start up late July and into August. So we'll get into all of this on this week's episode. We'll encourage you guys to reach out to Evan and myself if you guys have ideas or things you want to discuss. We'd love to talk some more X's and O's as we get into the summer, and he and I will be doing a sort of update on our position rooms. We did the plus-minus ratings on all the position rooms 2 episodes before our draft preview, kind of going into things. So I won't go too much into that now in detail. We'll just kind of give a general overview of the roster after we review the draft class and undrafted free agents. But first, it's a long-awaited return. I've actually got a whiskey segment, and since it's the summer and Scotch to me is more of a winter drink, we're going to go into a bourbon. I actually have a couple new ones to try. This week, we're going to High West and their Campfire, which is actually a mix of bourbon, whiskey, or bourbon, rye, and Scotch. Kind of a complex one. I won't lie, we opened the bottle with my 2 brother-in-laws a couple weeks ago, but this is the first sip I've had since then. So here we go. And as far as a bourbon goes, I guess this is really kind of mixed. So whiskey, American whiskey at that, I think it's pretty good. I looked it up on the distiller app that I have just to see what it was rated, and it was like a 3.72. I'm going to go a little higher and give it a 3.85. You can kind of taste a little bit of the smokiness. Like on the distiller app, they say it's got some peatiness to it. I don't know where you're going to get peat that kind of replicates Islay scotches, so that's kind of lost on me, but the flavor's really nice. You get a little bit of vanilla, cinnamon, and you get some of that smokiness on the finish, almost kind of like a fruity, smoky finish. A little complex. Kind of reminds me of like if Talisker 10 was a bourbon or a whiskey blend like this, kind of what it would be. So this one was a good one to try. There's another bourbon that I'll have on the show next week that I liked even more. And then we'll kind of get back into some of the Scotch bottles that I've got. So that's where we are for this week. Now, Dolphins draft class, as we are now a full week away. You'll have to excuse the sniffles. We've had some wild weather here in southeast Indiana where we've been kind of going back and forth between like 65 and 80 during the day, but then it'll drop down to like low 40s, high 30s at night. It's been real rainy, then it'll be sunny, and that's wreaked some havoc with colds and allergies and stuff like that. So pardon the sniffles if you hear them occasionally. I'll do my best to avoid them. And there we go, one more. So into the draft review. Obviously Miami picked 21st, and Evan and I had kind of run through this exercise based off of a tweet thread or X thread, whatever we're calling it now, from Chris Kaufman about with quarterbacks going on a run, potentially all 6 of the big ones. We thought 4 would go, but 6 actually went. We thought there'd be like a group of 17 players the Dolphins might have their pick of 1 or 2. And I talked about this on the last show with Evan and posted about this on a message board. And yes, I still post on thefins.com every once in a while. But going into the draft night, I kind of thought that Miami's pick was going to come down to 3 players. And I was perfectly fine with any of the 3. And the 3 were going to be Amarius Mims, Graham Barton, and Chop Robinson, unless Leatu Latu or Jared Verse were still on the board. Just kind of based on what I knew and a couple people that are way, way more in the know than I am, if you catch my drift. I thought that Miami would be inclined to take a pass rusher more than any other position group up high, more than receiver, more than defensive tackle, maybe even more than offensive tackle, unless one of like the real big names from the top of the first round fell. And the board fell really nicely for Miami. You had all offensive players taken through the first 14 picks. And Leatu Latu finally got taken at 15 by Indianapolis. So he was kind of off the board. And honestly, I really like Jared Verse a little better compared to Leatu Latu, so I was okay with that. And thought the board broke real nicely for Miami, and then you had this kind of bullwhip once we got to the Bengals pick at 18, because you saw Amarius Mims, Jared Verse, and then Troy Fautanu, who I actually thought was going to be gone before the Bengals picked. I thought Seattle would take him. So kind of when we got to 18, I was like, holy crap, like the Dolphins might actually get one of the big tackles. They might get Mims or Fautanu. I'm fine with both. Verse is still on the board. And then you saw all 3 of them go to the Bengals, Rams, Steelers, 18, 19, 20, respectively. So then, kind of based on the exercise that Evan and I had mapped out and that, Chris Kaufman had mapped out, to me, the Dolphins pick really came down to 2 players, and that was going to be Chop Robinson and Graham Barton. And for Miami specifically, like if you think about both of these guys, if you're taking Graham Barton, you're probably not playing him at tackle right away. You're probably trying to play him at guard because they gave a pretty nice contract to Aaron Brewer, who came over from Tennessee to play center. You have Armstead, you have Jackson, you locked up your depth with Kendall Lamb and still had Keon Smith. So guard was kind of the home, and then you think, long-term, Kendall Lamb's retiring after this year, Teron Armstead, based on how his contract has been restructured, most likely retiring. Does Graham Barton really have the movement and athleticism skills to play left tackle in the NFL? Even I, who was a huge Graham Barton fan, would be hesitant to say yes definitively on that. Whereas with Chop Robinson, you look at it for right now, in all likelihood, he probably goes into week 1, barring any other injuries to other players or himself, probably goes into week 1 as your 3rd outside linebacker behind Jaylen Phillips and Shaquille Barrett. Not to spill any beans, but probably not going to see Bradley Chubb active on the 53-man roster week 1. Probably going to be on PUP, or he's going to be an IR recall because of the new IR rules this year. So if you think about it, Chop Robinson's probably your 3rd edge player, and then probably drops a rung back to 4th when Chubb comes back, again, assuming everyone's healthy still. But there's a pathway, and it's not the optimal pathway that the Dolphins would choose. It might be a necessity just based on how you want to do contracts for Tua and Javon Holland, and then Jalen Phillips, Jalen Waddle. You might have a scenario where, Bradley Chubb is no longer on the roster in 2025 because they have an out. Shaquille Barrett signed a 1-year deal, with the way the Miami draft fell. There's a pretty plausible path to get to week 1 of 2025 where your top 2 outside linebacker, edge rush, pass rushers are Jalen Phillips and Chop Robinson. So I think to Miami that holds more value, and thus Chop was the pick. I've heard a couple people say that Miami, kind of leaked it that they had Chop rated higher than Latu and Verse. I cannot speak to that. That's, something I can only speculate on. I felt like Latu was more of a complete pass rusher. I felt like Verse was a more complete edge defender, in terms of run stopping ability than both of Latu and Chop. But I think Chop, you look at his metrics, had the second best 40 time, second best 10-yard split behind all the pass rushers in this year's draft. He was second to Dallas Turner, who was from Alabama. It was second to him in both of those metrics. And you just can't teach that ability to have balance and bend and be able to turn the corner like that. As far as Chop individually, like watching his film, you see a very nice burst off the ball. He's comfortable rushing from the left side or the right side. He can rush with his hand in the dirt. He can stand up. He's comfortable with stunts. There's some tape of him rushing over guards, which we'll talk about that more in a minute. What you don't see very much of is his ability to set the edge in the manner in which he would be required to in this defense, because Penn State was very much a fast flow, whereas this is kind of going to be more read and react when it comes to the run, which I think is fine. Miami was very good at it a year ago under Fangio, very good at it the year before under Josh Boyer. But with Chop Robinson, he doesn't have super long arms. He doesn't have that kind of ability to extend and set that hard edge and play the run very well. Now, he's very good at retracing. He's very quick, but he was more effective off stunts and different things like that. So that's something you're going to have to work with him on, but it's a teachable skill. Like, you can't teach that burst and the bend. But if you can teach him to use his hands more in pass rushing, if you can teach him to use his body positioning, better against the run, you've really got something nice to work off of. And as I mentioned before, and we talked about this, Evan and I did on our previous shows, with the way Anthony Weaver's setting up this defense, there's a number of kind of flexible fronts. Like, I would say the overall structure of it that you're going to see most commonly is nickel stuff, and it's not going to look very different from how Vic Fangio deployed the defense, just from a pure schematic perspective. Now, Baltimore did some interesting things where they'll stem their front late and shift everybody over. They'll exaggerate the front and shift everyone over two gaps and then walk an off-ball guy down to the edge. Jordan Brooks, cough, cough. There's going to be some odd stuff that they do that we never saw under Fangio. And where I think Chop Robinson fits in right away, because you're probably going to have Barrett and Phillips being your top two guys to start the season, and then Chubb when he gets back. Where Chop fits in is, if you watch his tape, Penn State used him a lot to rush over centers, and just that ability to kind of get that burst and build up to that speed and knock a center back just to create, a dented pocket for a quarterback. You're basically forcing him to step left or right into your pass rushers is a pretty nice weapon. And Baltimore did a lot more exotic, I think is the best word to describe it, did a lot more exotic things on third downs. They have a very cool package where, they're basically running a pick stunt over the center with a stand-up rusher and an off-ball linebacker. Again, Jordan Brooks, you can see why they were all over him and gave him such a big deal. But it's very easy for me to envisage Chop and Jordan Brooks being guys who are part of that. There's also plays where you have, guys walked up over the guard and, you have them picking off of a defensive tackle and going from, the front side B gap to the back side A gap. I don't think Chop Robinson is going to have much problem being able to execute that kind of stuff. Not much of it on tape from Penn State, but it's within his wheelhouse. And then on top of it, you can teach him to be a traditional three-down edge player. I also think with Chubb and Phillips coming off of injuries, when they're back, it's going to behoove Miami to have more of a rotation set up so you're not just chewing guys up in terms of snap counts the way that Fangio chewed up Chubb, Sealer, Wilkins, and Phillips last year. Wilkins was 81% of the snaps. Sealer was 76%. I think the edge guys in most of those games were getting, 60 to 70%, which is a lot. I think the rotation is going to help the overall defense. So that's where Chop Robinson fits in to me. Now, that was Miami's only pick. There was talk that they had, even Chris Grier said it in his post-night one presser, that they had tried to move back into the first round, late. I think that was probably for either Xavier Worthy or Xavier Legette, the two receivers, because Graham Barton went pretty quickly after their pick. But could certainly see a scenario where they would try and move back in for any of those three. And I think whoever that target was went in the first round, because I have no intelligence of them trying to move up in round 2 to the beginning. They just kind of sat and stood by their pick, which ended up being Patrick Paul, the tackle from Houston. And this one was kind of polarizing amongst the fan base, because you already had kind of the scuttle like, well, why would we take an edge player instead of a guard? Which I just kind of went over. Like, tackles and centers are much more important in this offense than a guard is. And they already have guards that have played in the NFL level. There's rumors that they're looking at guards still in terms of free agency, which will probably happen post June 1st at this rate now because of the Odell Beckham signing. The pass rusher thing makes much more sense. But then you have, in the same vein, people who complained about not addressing the offensive line complain about addressing the offensive line because it's not the player that they wanted. So Patrick Paul, polarizing guy to me. You look at his size and his length, 6'7", 331, has like 36-inch arms, like an 86-inch wingspan, which I think was the second largest of the entire draft class, any position. The guy looks the part. He looks exactly like how you would make a left tackle in a lab. I think he was a 2.5 or 3-year starter for Houston, built up over 1,000 snaps. I might have even been closer to 1,500 snaps. But when you go back and you look at his tape, or even if you've watched him in the Senior Bowl practices, the things I would say that stick out to me are, for someone who's got that much experience, for his technique to get as wonky and off-kiltered as it does is alarming. For these big, long arms that he's got, he doesn't really look like someone who's done MMA for 3 years, which Patrick Paul said he did on draft night when they interviewed him. He doesn't throw a quick jab. It's more this long, swooping, like pterodactyl wing swing. And he tends to get guys, outside their pad level. He's grabbing them on the outside. That's going to get called holding in the NFL. And then kind of his hands when he does this, if he gets kind of beat to the spot by a pass rusher, you notice that his feet kind of get a little wonky. Like his kick slide isn't that great. He tries to set outside, so hard that he almost gives up the inside post. And because he's so long, it's tough for defenders to get there, but you can see the potential for holding calls to happen if he exposes that inside door and rushers take advantage of it. So I think you've got to marry up all these technique issues and kind of solve it. The plus side is the dude's got great grip strength. Like, if he gets his hands on you, you're not moving. He's long enough as it is, so if you're going to try and get around him and, dip and get low and bend the edge, you better do it, as fast as like Cam Wake did, or Jaylen Phillips does now, or Von Miller in his prime, because he's just so long, you're probably not going to have time to get there, especially against Tua and how quickly he's able to get the ball out in this offense. So if you can work with him and fix those technique issues, I think the scheme, because of how quickly the ball gets out, because of how much depth guys like Hill and Waddle can get, even on 3 and 5 step drops where Tua's getting the ball out quick, I don't think these issues are going to, kind of rear themselves up as much as fans might think. I think the scenario where that would happen is like, less than 5 minutes in the fourth quarter, you need 2 scores, you got to throw it every down. You're just straight passing every down. That could be a problem. But the nice part is you've got Teron Armstead back and you have Austin Jackson back. So you don't have to count on him right away. He's already working with Teron Armstead at Duke Manyweather's O-line Masterminds Academy, which, for my money, best independent offensive line guru in the game. Lane Johnson works there. Rashawn Slater works there. Teron Armstead works there. I believe Austin Jackson was there last year, kind of helped bolster him into an extension. So I think Patrick Paul's in the right place and has the right mindset and knows what he needs to do to get better. It's just actually putting it there. But I would say this to Dolphins fans who are worried about this pick. Would it be all that surprising that if he actually has a decent camp, would it be that surprising if they ended up cutting Kendall Lamb, who's already announced his retirement at the end of the season? Would it be that surprising if they cut Kendall Lamb and gave Patrick Paul sort of the swing tackle job? Because you could still keep Kendall Lamb on the practice squad and call him up with the new rules. But maybe to get Patrick Paul some experience. We saw it multiple times in 2022 and last year, in games where the Dolphins, kind of ran away with it on the scoreboard. We saw them take out Teron Armstead just to preserve him and play guys like Kendall Lamb and Keon Smith. You could very easily see that scenario play out this year, but with Patrick Paul. So for me, if this is the guy that Butch Barry kind of handpicked a year after the work he did with, Liam Eichenberg playing center for the first time ever, with Lester Cotton being the offensive lineman that took your third highest percentage of snaps, with Kendall Lamb, with Robert Jones playing a bunch, I'm willing to give Butch Barry a little bit of carte blanche here. And if this is the guy that he identified and he thinks, I can make him my left tackle of the future, okay, fine. I'm willing to give him that chance. And that's kind of how I went with it. And then really didn't pay much attention to the rest of night 2 because Miami didn't have a 3rd-round pick. And, I remember I texted Travis Wingfield after Friday when he was done with his draft coverage for the Dolphins official website and his radio spots. And I said, man, maybe I'm just wrong, but I feel like Miami got 2 pretty solid players that are going to, probably be starters within the next year. I know that's not an ideal scenario when you've got 1st and 2nd round picks. So we're going to have, one more sip of this High West Campfire whiskey here. I know that's not the ideal scenario when you've got 1st round picks, but this is the first time in 3 years we've had a 1st and 2nd round pick combined. I think it's better to have at least a pathway to get these guys on the field than have a scenario with what's happening with Channing Tindall where, you'd like to think that player could be good. And, this offseason you brought in Jordan Brooks and Anthony Walker Jr., and you're just kind of okay, there's not much of a pathway for him there. So I probably feel a little more comfortable with Patrick Paul than most. As soon as they announced that Miami had a 30 visit with him, I actually got a text from someone about that 30 visit, not Travis, but someone else. I was kind of okay, this is probably a guy I need to kind of bump up a little higher from my Miami specific draft board. So I have some questions, obviously, about Patrick Paul, the pick, and what can you do with him. But I'm willing to give Butch Barry and Mike McDaniel's scheme kind of the carte blanche to kind of smooth these things over. You don't need him to be Laramie Tunsil protecting Deshaun Watson when he first got traded to Houston. You're not asking him to hold for 7-step drops while he meanders around in the pocket. You're asking to pass protect for the quarterback who literally got the ball out the 2nd fastest in the league last year, or first, whatever Tua was. He was near the top, if not at the top. I'm more okay with it given the whole scenario that Patrick Paul is coming into. The day 3 picks, the first 3 of them, probably, so I remember when the draft was, the first 3 rounds were on Saturday, the final 4 rounds were on Sunday. But for rounds 4, 5, 6, probably the most I guess in terms of players I'd seen, probably the most satisfying for me, and I think it's got a chance to be the most productive since like the 2010 draft class when they had Rashad Jones and Nolan Carroll both in the 5th round. Like, that's just what I'm going off of. And obviously they've had some fantastic, 5th and 6th round picks and stuff prior to that, Zach Thomas among that group. So kind of the story I'll lay out for Saturday, I'd actually made plans with 2 of my friends. We were going to go golfing. And it's been a hell of a month at work with a lot of transitioning. Had some different health scares with various family members. I needed a day to get away. And sitting there all day on the couch watching the draft, with my wife and 2 kids at home, I needed out of the house. So we decided to go golfing. And I remember my wife had taken my daughter shopping. Our other daughter had taken a nap. And as I'm getting ready, eating a quick lunch and getting ready to head out the door, because our tea time was at 2, as I'm about to head out the door, the Dolphins trade up and get on the clock, which, pretty surprising move. I didn't really expect that to happen. And then they took Jaylen Wright. I hadn't done a whole bunch of work on any of the running backs just because Miami's running back room is unchanged from a year ago. You still have Mostert, Achane, Ahmed, Wilson, Chris Brooks is back. Didn't think they would really address it. But I know several people within the draft community that I follow and trust that had Jaylen Wright either as their top back or their second back in the entire class. And I'd watched a little bit of him, and to me, he kind of reminded me of Raheem Mostert. And then you look at it, Jaylen Wright and Raheem Mostert are both 5'10". Mostert's 212, Wright's 210. I think Mostert ran like a 4.33 or 4.32 40. Jaylen Wright ran a 4.38. Mostert is kind of the one guy Miami has who can do a little bit of the inside zone and gap stuff in their run game, which is what Jaylen Wright specialized in Tennessee. To me, Jaylen Wright is like a 1-for-1 analog of Raheem Mostert, and he's probably your replacement for Raheem Mostert after this season or whenever they decide, to part ways. Looking at it now, though, you look back, Raheem Mostert's been hurt each of the last 2 years, especially down the stretch. Now, 2 years ago it was a freak thing with his hand or thumb or whatever it was. You can't really help that. But he got dinged up last year down the stretch and couldn't play in the Baltimore game and in the Buffalo game. And if I remember right, I think he did play in the playoff game, but missed the last 2 regular season games after the Dallas game. Achane missed, 6 games and then was still recovering from his shoulder injury in the preseason and only had 1 carry against New England in week 2. Having a third back who can do the Raheem Mostert portion of the offense, I think is an absolute plus for Miami. I think he's going to get carries. Jeff Wilson got carries last year, especially in that Dallas game towards the end of the season. I think Jaylen Wright can probably get more, and I think there's enough experimentation on tape where they use Devon Achane, in the slot, flexed out wide, or if you go back and look at the Giants game where they lined him up all over the place and he was getting, inside handoffs and reverse pivot handoffs and reverses. You still need another back on the field, and having someone like Jaylen Wright who can be like an analog for Raheem Mostert where you're not tipping, what your possible actions are to the defense as much is a good thing for Miami to have. And I think if I'm handicapping it with the Dolphins' top 4 running backs at this stage, you've got some redundancy between Raheem Mostert and Jaylen Wright, and then some redundancy between Devon Achane and Savon Ahmed. To me, it feels like those 4 plus Alec Ingold as a fullback makes a full running back room, and you probably don't have much of a role for Jeff Wilson or Chris Brooks, which was the case a year ago. But you need bodies to get through camp in the preseason, and there's always injuries, so. But Jaylen Wright, to me, trading up for that, getting some future value built in with present value, as someone who's gone through business school recently, that makes a lot of sense to me, even if it's not a starter year 1 right now. Loved that pick, even though it was kind of a surprise move to me. The next 2 picks were my 2 favorite of the entire draft class that Miami had. So in the 5th round, So at this point, I think we had gone to like hole 3 or 4 when we were about to tee off. And I actually hit like my first good drive of the day. And one of my buddies, we'll call him Dr. Dunk, he's a big dude, 6'8", shanked one off into the woods. And so I was in a cart by myself and my 2 buddies were riding together. So I kind of thumbed through the ESPN draft list and saw that Miami had taken Mo Kamara from Colorado State. So kind of the long story short version of how I came to know Mo Kamara as a prospect. Another group of friends had invited me to do a college football fantasy league last year. And I had Torrey Horton, who was a wide receiver for Colorado State, on my team. And he and Dallin Holker were basically that offense. So I would watch some of the Colorado State games because they're on late. We're on East Coast time where I live in Indiana. And would watch a couple Colorado State games and saw Mo Kamara when they were on defense. And, was pretty impressed with him. He kind of reminded me of just like sort of like a streamlined version of Courtney Upshaw, who, surprise, surprise, Baltimore Ravens pick, kind of crossed with Shaq Barrett, who also went to Colorado State. And I feel like they mentioned that on like damn near every broadcast. Then just kind of playing around with some of the mock draft simulators leading up to the last month, Mo Kamara was almost always on the board when Miami's 5th round pick came. And I was like, man, this guy, he should be higher than that. He should be gone off the board. Like, I'll take him here. And lo and behold, that's what happens to Miami. He had several people who said they had him in their top 75, if not the top 100. To get him at pick, 158? Like, that's big value. And to me, like, Mo Kamara, he's not much of a slouch of an athlete, like when you compare him to Chop. He's 6'1", 252, ran like a 4.5 in the 40. To me, he already plays the run better than Chop does. Like, he's been able to set the edge. He's comfortable playing left side and right side of the defense, so that's a plus. He's able to use his arms and his lockout strength. Again, he's doing it at a little bit lower level of school, but has more experience doing it. And I think the cool thing about him is that there's a great interview on the Bootleg Football podcast with Brett Coleman and EJ Snyder, and they talked to Mo Kamara at the Shrine Bowl practices leading up to the Shrine Bowl game. And they talked about how, Mo Kamara will switch up his footwork and does different things to kind of throw offensive linemen off. Like, he's a very football savvy guy. And I think he's doing things that, are more of the high IQ football type player that, you're still going to have to teach to Chop Robinson, because Chop's got his fastball. Mo Kamara's fastball isn't as good, but he's got other pitches in his repertoire, to use a baseball analogy. So to me, this one, Mo Kamara probably comes in. He's your 4th edge guy week 1. Probably drops down to your 5th guy by the time Chubb comes back, if everybody's still healthy. But again, talking about the plausible scenario, maybe by next year he's your 3rd edge defender, sort of a direct replacement to Andrew Van Ginkel, who, oh, by the way, 5th round pick back in 2019. So some parallels there from Mo Kamara to Andrew Van Ginkel. Loved that pick, and honestly, at that point, was kind of just like, okay, Miami's done well on day 3. They got Wright, they got Kamara. I know how they're going to use Chop, and I can envision what the plan is for Patrick Paul. Felt like they had a pretty solid draft at that point. And I think by it was after the turns, like hole 10 or 11, saw they had taken Malik Washington, and that's my favorite pick of all in the entire Dolphins draft. I remember talking with Travis Wingfield about that, and we were talking about, Miami still needs to address their receiver room beyond Hill and Waddle. Like, the guys you had last year just didn't produce enough. Like, you still have to make an addition. And we had talked about Odell Beckham, and, Travis had mentioned a couple of guys, Roman Wilson, Malachi Corley. I kept saying, dude, like, you need to watch Malik Washington. Malik Washington was my other receiver alongside Torrey Horton on the college football fantasy thing. Malik Washington led all of Division I in catches last year with like 110. He was like 54% of Virginia's offensive output for the year. which is absurd. They struggled to score points, but if they scored, it was most likely Malik Washington. Slot receiver with some ability to line up, as an X or as a Z, despite his size. He's 5'8", 190, ran a 4.48, so it's not like he's slow. He's not as timed fast as Braxton Berrios, but I think in terms of just being a better receiver, he bumped Braxton Berrios down a rung, and I think he'll go and prove that. So really love that pick. He was a sticks mover. I think he had like 10 conversions on like 3rd down and 6+ last year for Virginia. Like, only had like 3 drops in his whole career. Like, just a sure-handed guy who can play. There's a great segment with former Carolina Panther and Baltimore Raven receiver Steve Smith, who's been pretty good at kind of evaluating these receivers when they come out, for NFL Network. He loves Malik Washington. I had heard an interview, again, with Brett Coleman and E.J. Snyder with Eric Galko, who runs the Shrine game, talk about Malik Washington, and all those guys loved him. Got me watching him from last year from the fantasy perspective. Like, to me, and we'll talk about this, Evan and I, on the show, but I think the receiver room sets up pretty nicely, where, like, now you've got Hill, Waddle, Odell Beckham Jr. I think Malik is probably the guy that would be 4th. And then you've got, like, kind of 2 spots left where it's like, okay, Erica Zukama and River Craycraft are kind of the same body type and build. And then Braxton Berrios and Taj Washington are kind of the same body type, build, and role. That's where the competition kind of sits to me. I think Malik will kind of rise, to be that 4th guy. Second pick in the 6th round for Miami was Patrick McMorris, a safety out of Cal. I think I had seen maybe 1 game of San Diego State play when he was with them. Didn't know much about him, didn't really have him on my board. I'd actually tracked a bunch of Miami's meetings with safeties and never had anything with him. I think he said as much on his post-draft interview, where they really didn't have much contact after the combine. So to me, this is sort of like a scout's pick, where someone's like jumping on the table, like, we've got to take this guy, he's still on the board. Just kind of watching some film on him this past week. Seems like one of those guys where, like, good player in college, smart player, he knows what to do, he knows where to be. He just doesn't seem like he's going to be able to do that with the requisite speed and athleticism required to play safety in the NFL. The other interesting thing to me was that they ended up taking him over Sanusi Kane from Purdue, who went around later to Baltimore. I know Miami had met with Sanusi. So that was a little bit interesting to me. Don't know much of what to expect with Patrick McMorris, other than, like, this is probably a guy where, special teams is your ticket to make it. And then their final pick in the 7th round, Taj Washington out of USC. When's the last time we had, like, a straight-up 7th round pick make the team? I think Myles Gaskin is the answer there in 2019, or Malcolm Perry in 2020, I guess would be it. Taj Washington, to me, like I just said, good punt return ability. He's got some speed down the field, really short-handed. Again, another smaller guy, even smaller than Malik. Malik's 5'8", weighs 190, so he's well built. Taj is 5'9", like $174. He might weigh less than that. But again, really short hands. If you watch his Shrine Bowl highlights, made one of the greatest catches of that week that you'll see in practice that week. You look at his tape at USC, I think he does a really nice job of, especially when Caleb Williams is doing Caleb Williams things, of sort of finding like dead spaces of the field to kind of drift and move to and become an open target for Caleb when the plays go off script. I think this one is probably like Braxton Berrios should be pretty nervous. I think River Craycraft might be as well. because I think the hidden weapon here with Taj is he can return punts. And with the new NFL kickoff rules this year, I think a kickoff return is more akin to a punt return now. So that might be the kind of hidden battle within that battle to get the sixth receiver spot would be Taj Washington. I think has a good shot to make the roster, just kind of depending on how the numbers game plays out at other positions. And then Miami obviously had undrafted free agents, added 12 guys to the team. You look back over the past couple years, I think they've had 3 or 4 guys kind of make it right out of camp or get called up into the season. 2 years ago, you had Kader Kohu from day one, but you also got contributions from Verone McKinley later that year, and there's someone else from that 2022 undrafted free agent class who I can't think of off the top of my head. And then you look at last year, you had 3 guys make the actual roster right out of camp. Chris Brooks, the running back, made it. Julian Hill, the tight end, made it. And Brandon Pilley, the nose tackle, made it. And then you ended up getting Ethan Bonner, on the roster later in the season. So I don't think Miami is averse to having guys make it. There's really kind of 4 to 5 guys I've kind of got earmarked as guys that, like, okay, at the very least they should probably be on the practice squad. So the guys I think that have a legit shot to make the roster would be Matt Jones, the guard from Ohio State, who was a center recruit coming out of high school, played 1 game of it at Ohio State, which was their bowl game against Missouri, and he looked pretty good doing it. Got some size, got some movement skill. I think at worst, he's probably got a legit shot to unseat like Lester Cotton from the roster. He's probably got a legit shot to unseat Liam Eichenberg if they don't like Liam Eichenberg's cap number as a backup center. That's where I would go with it. So he's probably the guy that I would think the most on offense would have a chance to make it. On defense would be Mark Perry, the safety from TCU. Again, kind of like Patrick McMorris, plays multiple roles. He can play the slot. He can play split safety. He can play single high, which I think is big in this kind of new Ravens-style system Miami's going to be running. Those 2 are the guys that I think have the top chance. Andrew Meyer, the center from UTEP, who I think was either the highest or second highest in terms of pass block win rate in the country last year for centers. You could maybe see that one developing into something. And then there's 2 other guys that I think, could probably push for practice squad spots. The first one would be Gavin Hardison, the quarterback from UTEP. Monster arm, pretty well built. He's like 6'2", 6'3", about 215 pounds, kind of built like Skylar Thompson. Had a massive arm, and kind of made things happen for UTEP. Then he had to have Tommy John surgery. Same surgeon did his arm as did Brock Purdy for the 49ers. It's also the Texas Rangers team doctor, so probably well skilled in that Tommy John surgery. Where I think Hardison could benefit Miami is if he plays well, and you get some improved play from Skylar Thompson in the preseason. Maybe there's some impetus to move off of Mike White at that $5.5 million salary or whatever it is for 1 more year, and you could develop Thompson and Hardison. Because let's face it, if something happens to Tua where, he's missing more than a game at a time, the season's probably going down the drain pretty quickly. Maybe Mike White's good for 1 spot start here and there, but we know Skylar Thompson's been good at times in the past and has shown well in the preseason. With the new practice squad rule, you're now able to keep a quarterback on your practice squad and elevate him every week with no limits. So maybe that's where Gavin Hardison comes into play. You don't have to keep him on the 53, but you can call him up for game day to be that 3rd guy under that new rule. And then the other guy would be Grayson Murphy, the edge rusher from UCLA. Pretty talented kid, kind of played behind his brother Gabriel and then Leatu Latu, obviously. I think Grayson Murphy's probably going to fall victim to a numbers game. So this might be one where, he plays well in the preseason and everyone likes him, but you're stuck realistically behind Jalen Phillips, Shaq Barrett, Chop Robinson, Mo Kamara, and then whenever Bradley Chubb comes back. So even if you're the fifth guy to start the year, you're probably not playing much. You may not be active on game day, and then Bradley Chubb's coming back at some point. The numbers don't work in your favor as an edge rusher, but maybe this is a guy that sticks on the practice squad or he shows well and gets signed to another team's roster. I think he's got some playability. And then obviously Friday they signed Odell Beckham Jr. This was kind of a move I expected to happen. Odell last year with Baltimore, really good at running slants, hitches, in-breaking routes, kind of doing some dirty work stuff. Because obviously Baltimore had Rashad Bateman and especially Zay Flowers as kind of their primary receiving threats. I think right here you can use Odell in a number of different ways, kind of like they did in the Rams scheme under Sean McVay, which is the same offense as what Miami's running here under Mike McDaniel, where you can kind of use Odell, as an X, as a Z, and as an F in the slot, and kind of maximize his ability with some of these short yardage, third down conversion catches, running some of these tighter routes that aren't, developing down the field, because we've had some issues, and like it or not, Hill and Waddle have both dropped footballs. They've had their fair share. OBJ's pretty short-handed. And this is probably someone that if he's going to play in the slot or do some of the work at like X, you can kind of have Malik Washington and Eric Ezukama kind of shadow around and kind of model your game after. Odell only 5'11", but I always feel like he's kind of a bigger body than that and plays well. Still has some fuel in the tank, I think, and as long as he kind of understands the role, which, it appears like he would if he's taking less money to come to Miami. I talked about it before, but I feel like, your receiver room 1 through 4 is really, really good with Hill, Waddle, Beckham, and I think most likely Malik Washington. And then you've still got talent like Eric Ezukama and Taj Washington to try to develop, alongside guys who've played in the NFL with River Craycraft and Braxton Berrios. So you're setting yourself up pretty nicely in those situations, I think, with that signing. In terms of what I would look at moving forward, looking at free agents out there, Darryl Worley makes a lot of sense at safety. Played in Baltimore last year. I think unless Miami really plans on using Jalen Ramsey in a bunch of different roles, which is highly possible, I would still feel more comfortable if they had a better third option at safety than either Elijah Campbell or Patrick McMorris or a Mark Perry. And I don't really feel all that comfortable about having Jordan Poyer as like your other guy alongside Javon Holland. I would much rather have Jordan Poyer be like the third safety and have someone else who's got experience in the system. So I think safety is probably one spot they still look at. And then I also think, at some point they might make an addition on the offensive line, just another veteran that can move inside and play. Because I think right now, if you were penciling in like week 1 lineups from left to right, it's probably Teron Armstead, Isaiah Wynn, Aaron Brewer. Right guard is a question mark, and then Austin Jackson at right tackle. I think, and I don't really know where this whole Liam Eichenberg at right guard thing came from, other than the quote that Liam said he feels more comfortable on the right, but he really hasn't done well playing right guard. I think he's been better at left guard and center. I think the right guard job is probably a competition between Robert Jones and Jack Driscoll, and perhaps some veteran to be named late, after June 1st, are kind of the spots where I feel like Miami's still going to, make some additions. I wish they would consider a different punter than Jake Bailey, but I understand the why behind it. Jake didn't have the greatest of years last year, but he sure did work some wonders with Jason Sanders and kind of gave him some more confidence, and Sanders had a really nice bounce back year. I think Bailey, for the most part, did what was asked of him. He's not going to outkick his coverage, but there were a few shanks here and there that you need to get cleaned up. But that's kind of where I feel like Miami's roster's at. I think kind of building out their defensive tackle rotation. Anthony Weaver used 5 guys last year. You look at Miami right now, it's probably Zach Sealer, Tier Tart, Benito Jones. Those 3 probably seem like the most, likely to play the top 3 levels of snaps. And then I would say Neville Gallimore and Jonathan Harris are probably right in line after that. Because again, Sealer and Harris, as far as body type, are redundant. Neville Gallimore, Tier Tart, as far as body type, kind of redundant. And then you have a true nose in Benito Jones, although I think Tier Tart can play nose very effectively. But, still have some concerns about how you layer the defense, and we'll talk about that on the next show with Evan. That's going to do it for me tonight. We've reviewed the draft class, some of the undrafted free agents, and where Miami might turn next. Thank you guys for tuning in. Again, follow me on Twitter at KevinMD4. You can follow the show on iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Thank you guys. Follow the Dolphins Talk family. Have a great week, and Evan and I will be back with another episode next week. Thank you guys. Bye.